So welcome back from the break. Let's take a look at the concept check question and then we'll move on and talk about the origin of limbs and terrestrial tetrapods. So what derived characteristics do cartilaginous and bony fish have in common? What features are unique to bony fish? Well, remember that both of them are jawed vertebrates. So they have jaws, they have 4 cassettes of Hox genes. Let me just check my notes here, make sure I don't forget anything. Yeah, so they are gnathostomes. They have a lateral line, that sensory organ that they all share. They have paired sets of fins, so they have pectoral fins and pelvic fins. They have an enlarged forebrain, as we would expect for all gnathostomes. That's a feature of gnathostomes. So those are all features that they share in common. What do bony fish have that cartilaginous fish don't have? Well, one is a mineralized skeleton. They also have a swim bladder to provide neutral buoyancy. And let me just make sure that I haven't forgotten anything else. Yeah, sharks have the spiral valve in their digestive tract, and ray-finned fish, as bony fish, also have the supporting structures in their fins. All bony fish have some supporting structure in their fins. Cartilaginous fish do not. Their fins are strictly cartilage. They're solid cartilage, not rays of cartilage, as you expect to find in bony fish. In the case of ray-finned fish, it is rays of bone, these thin, fine bones that form the rays. In lobe-finned fish, it's a more solid bony structure that I described earlier as being akin to a primitive limb structure. And therein lies the origin of limbs, as we are about to discover. So when we start talking about tetrapods, we need to remember that tetrapods have 4 limbs. That's what the name means. And those limbs are derived from the modifications of a base structure that we see in the fleshy, bony fins of lobe-finned fish, specifically lobe-finned fish that are closely related to modern-day lungfish. We could also include coelacanths there, but the coelacanth fin is not as highly adapted as that of lungfish, because lungfish really do use their fins for walking on dry land. That is the whole thing behind lungfish, the fact that they are perfectly capable of migrating across dry land from body of water to body of water. And they're able to do so because they have an air-breathing organ, a lung, that is vascularized and able to carry out gas exchange. And they have fins that contain bones that can support not so much the weight of the fish on dry land, but allow it to lever its body forwards across dry land. And they can travel over quite long distances. Now, you're not going to be able to go out and observe a lungfish because lungfish are exclusively found in the southern hemisphere. So there are, depending on who's doing the classifications, 3 or 4 species of lungfish. There are lungfish found in South America, there are lungfish found in South Africa, and there are lungfish found in northeastern Australia. And all of them share these common features of having an air-breathing organ that functions like a lung and fins that allow them to maneuver their bodies across dry land. So the derived features of tetrapods that are unique to all terrestrial tetrapods are the presence of the 4 limbs with feet and digits. That's not unusual there. The ability to hear sounds in air. So the ability to detect vibrations in water is a function of the lateral line. But the lateral line won't work in air because air is a less viscous medium for transmission of sound. So having an organ system like the lateral line, which involves the compressibility of fluids, is simply not going to work when you transition to dry land and now you want to detect vibrations in the air. So a new structure needs to evolve, and this is going to be the ears. Then other things that you notice about terrestrial tetrapods, and again, you see this in all terrestrial tetrapods, is the fact that the head is no longer fused to the body. There is a separate structure, the neck, that separates the head from the body, something that no aquatic tetrapod or aquatic gnathostome, the fish, possesses. So no fish has a neck. And this becomes important in understanding the transition from fish to true terrestrial tetrapods. The other thing that you notice about terrestrial tetrapods, particularly the early terrestrial tetrapods, is that their head is flattened dorsoventrally, whereas in fish, the head is flattened laterally. So a fish head is flattened this way. The early terrestrial tetrapods have a head that's flattened this way. It's also connected on a neck, so they can move their head like this and like this. The best a fish can do is twist the body to move the head side to side, but they can't move their head this way, and they certainly can't maneuver the head side to side in the way that a terrestrial tetrapod can. They also have a pelvic girdle that now becomes fused to the backbone and becomes the beginning of a pelvis for supporting the hind limbs. And the pharyngeal clefts, not slits anymore because they're not going to be adapted to gas exchange, get repurposed and co-opted into other structures. We've talked about some of those in terms of structures associated with the head and with the neck and the inner ear. So the supporting structures for the pharyngeal clefts become associated with features associated with the neck, the skull, and the inner ear. So when we start thinking in terms of the origin of tetrapods, the first evidence of true tetrapods that have 4 limbs that are capable of supporting an animal outside of the water is an animal called Acanthostega. It was found in rocks dating to about 365 million years ago in Greenland. It has some adaptations for aquatic life, so it does have a fish-like tail that allows it to swim, but it does have limbs that are attached to a shoulder-like arrangement and to a hip-like arrangement that suggests that it was perfectly capable of walking on land. And it has limbs that look very much like modern-day limbs in terms of their basic structure: 1 big bone, 2 big bones, cluster of little bones, digits. So this is a skeleton of one of these early Acanthostega-like animals, and you can see that it does possess a shoulder-like arrangement, a hip-like arrangement. It's got limbs that have the 1 big bone, 2 big bones, cluster of little bones, digit arrangement. It's got a flattened scale that would flattened tail, sorry, that would allow it to swim a little bit more. And if you're wondering where this picture comes from, it's one of my own pictures. This was taken again at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, where they have a large collection of fossils that were of interest to me specifically for this class. So this is an Acanthostega-like animal. It's related to Acanthostega. You can see that the head is dorsoventrally flattened. It has a neck. It has eyes on the top of the skull. It has nostrils on the top of the skull, which is suggestive of the fact that it still may have spent a substantial amount of time in shallow water. Maybe it was a ambush predator, something like a crocodile, but it certainly had the ability to move on to dry land. So it is considered to be an early example of a primitive terrestrial tetrapod, ancestor to modern day amphibians. In the meantime, if we take a look at the modern day accepted phylogeny, you have the lungfishes, which have the fins that allow them to walk on dry land and a lung-like feature that allows them to do gas exchange in air. But then you have in the fossil record a couple of organisms that show a progressive transition to towards a more limb-like fashion, but still retain very true fishy features. So this is not a walking limb, but it is more limb-like than fin-like in terms of fish. But this is still a true fishy creature. Here is Acanthostega. And these two organisms are separated by around, so if you've got Acanthostega here at around 350 to 365 million years ago, you've got Panderichthys at around 425 million years ago. So you've got a time period in here of around 50 million years during which you've got the possibility of the emergence of true limbs. And this is one of the really great detective stories and a really great example of how evolutionary theory can be used predictively to identify a location and a time period where a particular type of fossil should be expected to be found, and then going out and actually finding it. So the individual who's responsible for this is a biologist by the name of Neil Shubin. He is the chair of the anatomy department at the University of Chicago. And he looked at the fossil of Acanthostega and the fossil of Panderichthys and said, somewhere in here, there's got to be a fish-like creature that has a true limb structure, not something that is approaching a limb structure, but actually shows true limb structure. And he looked at maps of the world, geological maps of the world, and identified 3 regions where rocks would exist that would be derived from a freshwater environment, because these animals were known to have existed in freshwater streams and shallow lakes, and looked for a fossil bed that had not been looked at before. And the only fossil bed that or section of deposit of rocks that he could find that had not been looked at that met these requirements were on an island off the north coast of Canada, where the total time period that he would have to look for fossils equaled about a month, maybe a month and a half every year. He was fortunate that he was able to get grant funding to go and take a look. And for a number of years, he and his graduate students and a couple of colleagues would go up every year and search in the valley that he had identified where these rocks existed, hoping to find evidence of the fossil that he was looking for. Eventually, one of his graduate students stumbled across fish bones that had clearly been weathered out of a deposit that was higher up on the side of the valley. But it was right at the very end of that year's fossil hunting season. So they marked off the region that they were interested in and came back the next year and started exploring up the side of the valley until they found the layer of rock where the fossils were coming from. And within a few weeks, they had discovered the beginnings of what would turn out to be the fossil that they were looking for, which became known as Tiktaalik. And you can see Tiktaalik here. Tiktaalik is an intermediate between Acanthus stega as a four-limbed semi-aquatic animal with limbs capable of walking on dry land, and true fish-like creatures. It has four limbs that have the one big bone, two big bones, cluster of little bones, digit arrangement. It has a shoulder. It has a wrist, which means that this is also a creature that could do push-ups. It has the dorsoventrally flattened skull. It has a neck. It has eyes on the top of the skull. It has nostrils on the top of the skull. It has a lung, but it also has gills. It has a laterally flattened tail, so it's got a fishy tail. It has hind fins that are more fin-like than limb-like, but it has the beginnings of limbs. It is the intermediate between a four-limbed creature and true fishy creatures. And it was found where it was predicted to be, or where it was predicted it ought to be, in rocks of a certain age, representing deposits from a particular type of habitat, and having the features that would be expected of an intermediate between Acanthus stega and Panthericthes. It's a great detective story. If you want to find out more about it, Shubin has written a book called You're in a Fish that details the hunt for Tiktaalik and what it represents in terms of the evolution of terrestrial tetrapods. And he also did a video series. I have the video series on DVD, and I show that when we do labs on campus. There is plenty of information about the origin of terrestrial tetrapods from their fishy ancestors in easily accessible form in terms of books written for non-scientists. So if you want to find out more about this, I would highly recommend the book, You're in a Fish. It goes into great detail about the origin of terrestrial tetrapods and how your body is a reflection of a modification of a basic fish anatomy, something that I've already started to detail a little bit. But Shubin goes into a whole lot more detail in his book. So this is Tiktaalik's, the Tiktaalik skeleton. Again, you can see the dorsoventrally flattened skull, eyes on the top of the skull. The nostrils are not too clear, but they are located here on the top of the skull. It's got a neck, it's got shoulder bones. You can see the limb structure here. One big bone, two big bones, cluster of little bones, digits. One of the things that you should remember is that in terms of digits, it does not have 5 digits as we would expect. It has up to 10 digits in some early terrestrial tetrapods. We're not actually entirely sure why the vast majority of terrestrial tetrapods are derived from ancestors with 5 digits. So primates have 5 digits. Lots of other terrestrial tetrapods have 5 digits, or some adaptation of that 5-digit form. But the early terrestrial tetrapods could have had up to 10 digits based on the fossils. Tiktaalik itself had 8 digits. But you can see that it does have features that are fish-like, and it also has features that are very much terrestrial tetrapods. So it represents an intermediate along the way to the development of a full tetrapod condition. So the earliest, or the first group of terrestrial tetrapods that are extant today that we will talk about are the amphibians. Again, these are the first terrestrial tetrapods to emerge from these early limbed fish-like creatures that had the capacity to venture onto land, probably chasing insects as a food source, Amphibians are the first to evolve characteristics that will allow them to more permanently occupy dry land. And the name amphibia means two lives, which is a perfect reflection of amphibians. Because remember, amphibians reproduce and spend their juvenile period, their larval period in water, but then transition to, in most cases, a fully terrestrial life. So they have a juvenile life in the water and an adult life on dry land, hence the name amphibian, two lives. There are three clades of amphibians. So there is the group known as the Urodela, which translates as tailed ones. My pen, what did I do with it? So Urodela translates as tailed. Because salamanders and newts, which are a subset of salamanders, all have tails. The vast majority of them are aquatic juveniles, but then metamorphose into terrestrial adults. So you can see an example here, but we've already seen previously the example of the axolotl, the salamander that comes from Mexico, around Mexico City, that actually retains the gills into adulthood and can remain as a fully aquatic adult. Interestingly enough, if axolotls are raised in a non-aquatic environment, they will actually, within a generation, produce offspring that are fully terrestrial. They actually shed the juvenile characteristics, they shed the gills, and they become fully terrestrial. So in the case of the axolotl, the pedomorphosis is more a function of the environment that they excuse me, are raised in. If their environment is strictly aquatic, then they retain the aquatic juvenile features into adulthood. If the environment is more terrestrial, then they shed the juvenile characteristics and take on the fully terrestrial characteristics. It actually caused a huge amount of confusion in Europe when axolotls were shipped from Mexico for the first time, along with the description of them having gills. When they arrived in Europe initially, yes, they did have gills, but when they were raised in Europe, in the absence of their aquatic environment, they transitioned to their terrestrial form, and people thought there was something wrong here because they were not behaving as they had been described. It would take many, many years for people to finally figure out exactly what the situation was. So those are the Urodelas. The next are the Anura. These are the frogs and toads, and this translates as tailless ones, which is the perfect description of frogs and toads because they have a tail in their juvenile form, the tadpole, but they shed that when they metamorphose to their adult terrestrial form. So a classic frog or a toad, as you are familiar with. And then we have Apoda, or the Caecilians. These are the ones that you may not be terribly familiar with. And this translates as legless ones. Again, a perfect description because these are amphibians that have shed their legs. They look very snake-like, and they are sometimes confused with snakes, but they are not snakes. These are actually amphibians, and you can tell by the structure of the body. It is very different from the structure of a snake body. They have very poor eyesight because they spend a lot of their time burrowing underground. They have very moist skin because they do a lot of their gas exchange through their skin. And many times you probably wouldn't be aware of the fact that they are present because they spend so much time underground. They are tropical. in nature. So it is very unlikely that you will ever encounter one here in Florida. You have to go to the tropics to actually encounter one. So we talked about the idea that they live two lives, juvenile aquatic life and terrestrial adult life. Most of them have to return to water for reproductive purposes. So here you can see a pair of frogs in the process of reproducing. The female lays the eggs into water, and the male secretes sperm to fertilize the eggs as the female releases them. And then the eggs, or the zygote, develops inside the egg, supported by the yolk, until the larva attach in the form of hatch in the form of the tadpole. That then becomes a very active predator in the aquatic environment. It does possess a lateral line, which is a reflection of its life as an aquatic organism, but it loses the lateral line and the gills as it metamorphoses into a frog. It changes its way of gas exchange. It does it through the skin, or it practices what is known as buccal breathing, where it drops the floor of the mouth. The mouth is called the buccal cavity. So it drops the floor of the mouth to draw air in. In the meantime, a pair of flaps over the glottis remain closed so that the air fills the mouth. Then it closes its mouth, raises the floor of the mouth, and forces the air through the flaps of the glottis into the lungs for gas exchange. It's not a terribly efficient way of breathing, but it works for the amphibians, because salamanders do it, frogs and toads do it. I don't know whether the caecilians do it, but certainly salamanders, frogs, and toads use buccal breathing as a way of doing gas exchange, to supplement gas exchange through the skin. So those are the amphibians. Let's take another break for a moment. And then we will talk very quickly about well, actually, I'm going to take a major break here myself personally. But when we come back, we're going to talk about the amniotes. So remember, amphibians still need to reproduce in water in order to be able to successfully reproduce. So they still have that tie back to water. So that limits their ability to colonize dry land. It would take the emergence of amniotes in the amniote egg to allow for the true colonization of dry land, which will be the subject of our next section. But let's take a break. Let's look at this concept check question, and I'll see you on the other side of the break with the answer to this. So many amphibians live as adults in dry terrestrial environments, while others never transition to dry land, continuing as fully aquatic adults. What adaptations permit these lifestyles? I'll see you on the other side of the break with the answer.